Appears to be an increase in the number of independent candidates contesting the local government elections. Let's get some analysis on this and other issues with Ebrahim Fakir from the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Very good evening to you. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening. So what role do small parties and independents play in local government elections?
Well, I mean, in local government elections, because the specificity of dynamics are so localized, particular interest groups, particular types of politics, particular issues even get articulated at very localized level, and therefore smaller parties, particularly those who have a very localized presence, do slightly better. But we can't blanket generalize about the fact that smaller parties or independents are always representing or are more responsive to the communities in which they're in. Because the dynamic surrounding independents or small parties certainly is determined by the genesis. That means, in other words, where did they come out from? Why are they there? Why do they exist? What do they wish to articulate? Because remember, some of the parties, and particularly some independents, actually come out of mainstream parties, either because they've had a dispute inside a mainstream party, either because they have fallen on the wrong side of a faction or of a dominant faction, particularly in that local area or in that province or in that region, or sometimes they have had a split in a big major party, and this is some kind of offshoot. But sometimes, I think we must also understand that sometimes political parties, particularly big ones, realize that they might not gather the traction in particular communities, right? It's either because they have a history of being unresponsive, but especially unaccountable, their performance have been woeful, and so their chances of being elected on a party brand or a party ticket is low, so they find someone who's aligned to the party and put them up to stand as an independent. So there are multiple reasons why you have this phenomenon, right? And so we should be careful in understanding where they come from in order to understand what purpose they might serve or how well they might do.
All right, let's continue then unpacking that. What could the impact be with these increased number of independent candidates on the results that we'll see post-November the 1st?
Well, Zinga, I think first we must unpack the fact that, look, independents don't always perform very well. And if you look at every successive local government election from 2000, when the inception of the new transformed local government system was brought about, since then, in every local election, there's been a greater amount of independents who stand. In some cases, they get elected, of course, and in some cases, they don't perform that well. And the reasons they don't perform that well is because it is resource heavy. It is very resource intensive because you have to campaign, number one. Number two, remember, independents only stand in a particular ward, and our local elections have two components. The one is the ward component, where you vote in a geographic area, in your constituency, in your local area, right? That's the one. The second is you vote on the PR map, the proportional representation aspect. In that aspect, you have to be registered as a party. So the independents can't contest the PR component. They only contest the ward individual geographic area component. And so their impact, once they are in council, they might represent or they might be more responsive to a particular community, but their major impetus in the way in which they conduct oversight, there's some opportunity for that, but their influence is in fact diluted, and their ability to have a major policy impact is diluted unless, of course, they work in concert with a range of other political parties or other actors in councils. Because remember, you're standing here as a lone wolf, as a person on your own, as an independent, sometimes as a small party. You have to band and work together with others to be able to have any kind of impact and influence. Otherwise, you become this kind of lone maverick who's there all on your own. So it's very difficult to operate once you are in council. unless, of course, you can work in concert with others. But there is opportunity to be more responsive. There is opportunity to be more representative of that particular community, of that particular area, and raise its problems. But we also mustn't lose sight of the fact that when you talk about independent candidates, largely who represent a ward councillors are much less powerful than the PR councillors. Proportional representation councillors are way more powerful in councils, and the political parties like it that way because the PR councillors carry the mandates of their parties. And so they like it when the PR councillor is more powerful than the ward councillor, and therefore local community issues don't actually get aired properly at council because those councillors, the ward councillors, are often, like in this two-tier system, are often weaker.
All right. So I'm going to ask two questions in one. The first one is about the additions to the voters' roll, about 325,000. Some people saying that's a very small amount of new voters. What implications, if any, does that have, first of all? Second of all, misinformation and disinformation during the run-up to the local government elections. Are we seeing that, and to what extent?
We're seeing a fair bit of misinformation. Let me start with the second aspect. So two particular issues which we can pick up. The first is that people say, if you don't turn out to vote, your vote will automatically translate into a vote for another party. Now, that's not strictly speaking true. What happens in a semi-proportional system, like I've just explained, like our local government system, those voters who turn out for their preferred party, obviously, this is obvious. They would be contributing to the vote of their party. Now, because you have a proportionate system, the mathematics would show that even if there isn't a shift of voters to another party, of the voters who stay away, their party and the party who they potentially would have voted for is disadvantaged, and that the party whose voters did turn out, their share in the proportions go up, so it shows up more. But that you don't turn out to vote is ethically defensible, particularly where there's very low trust in governmental systems and extremely low trust and confidence in political parties. The second bit of misinformation has been information which says, if you don't turn out to vote and you don't vote, you lose the right to complain. You mustn't complain if you don't vote. Now, while it's a civic duty, it would be very responsible, it would be important to vote. If you feel you can't in good conscience vote, well, that's your conscience and our constitution allows that. But that does not dilute any of the other rights you have. It does not dilute your right to complain. It does not, in fact, negate any of the exercise of other rights. So you can still expect high levels of service delivery. You can still expect to hold your local council accountable. You can still complain. You can still moan. You retain every right that any citizen has, irrespective of whether you vote or you don't vote. Now on to your second part. There's the number of new voters, and this is complicated because the number of people we've lost off the voters' roll because of the excess deaths, because of COVID-19 and so on, is actually not being compensated by new voters. Now, this is an indicator of two things. In the 2019 election, even though voter registration was high, the turnout of voters was in fact low. So all of those people who registered but simply didn't turn out, together with those who were 18, who would ordinarily be able to vote but who didn't register and therefore weren't eligible. If you add the two of those figures were greater than the number of people who voted for the majority party. That means that though the party which is elected into power enjoys legitimacy because they voted in majority, there is an increasing credibility crisis. And when there's a credibility crisis for very long, it starts bordering onto a legitimation crisis, which is very worrying when in a democracy and when you want a democratic government to be able to exercise the power and authority that it does. So lower voter numbers, lower numbers on the voters' roll is in fact a worrying thing because it's either pointing to two things: A, complete mistrust in the system, or apathy to an extent where people simply don't want to participate.
Ebrahim Fakir, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening. He's with the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, joining us, speaking about independent candidates, a little bit more around local government elections.